Hi guys, so I realised I've had a really unique experience in the last few years because I have been living in UK, China and Dubai. So I realised that very few people have this kind of experience, so I'm going to share more about what it's like living in China, UK and Dubai and comparing the differences. So I'm going to go through all the different aspects like a population and cost of living and what it's like living there and why I chose to move to Dubai. So first, looking at the population of those three places. So here is some information about the population of each of the countries. So another of the big differences is the culture between the three places. The UK, what I would say, is a very multicultural place, which is predominantly British people, and there's a large number of people from around the world, so it's very multicultural. Dubai is a much more international place because the local population is much fewer. There's probably about 10 or 15%. You can see the statistics of how many people here are from Emiratis and how many people are international. But China is very different because it is monocultural society, which means that the vast majority of people are Chinese, Han Chinese, and the population of foreigners is very small. That's a very big difference in the countries, which also has a big impact on what it's like to live in those places as well. So in terms of the COVID situation, because that has a big impact on all of these three places, they also have pretty extreme COVID responses, as you may have seen in China. Actually, China has basically did complete zero COVID policy, which means that there was no COVID in China, and they're trying their hardest to eliminate COVID. And it was actually, for a long time, that was actually very pleasant because it meant that everything was very peaceful, although China was very closed off to the world, which I found part of the reason why I moved to Dubai. UK, on the other hand, had a more mixed approach of kind of locking down, opening, and changed, and was a very mixed approach. And UAE had a very open approach where they were one of the first to open the economy, and I think in some ways UAE has benefited and had one of the best responses to COVID seems to have had the most positive effect from COVID out of the three economies. One really important graph that I want to look at, which is the population pyramid of these three countries. You can see that UK is very much like a column, and in terms of there's a very big mixture of people who are older and younger, and is almost very equal, as UK has the most aging population with the highest average age out of all of the three countries. This has a big effect about what it's like to live there because it has an effect on taxes, it has an effect how things are running, and the labour cost as well. In terms of China, it has a very interesting population period, which is partly due to some things that have happened in history. And you can see here they have these big increases and then decreases, and part of this is the one-child policy and some of the history in China. And you can see here that actually recently there's a very sharp decline in the birth rate in China, which is a very big issue, which may be similar to what has happened in Japan, where it has an aging population. And so China is grappling with this issue, which may happen in the future. And UAE has a much more of a working population with very few old people and much more males, working males, as you can see here. So when you look at the population pyramids of these three countries, it's really important because I've realized and I've learned that the population pyramid has a huge effect on the economy and what it's like to live in those places. Part of the reason that China has been developing so fast in the last 20 or 30 years is because it has had a very favorable population pyramid where it has had this massive group of people who are working, and they are developing each year and contributing to the economy, getting wealthier, buying property and all of these things. What's going to happen in the future is very hard to tell in these three countries. In terms of UAE, they also have a very different population pyramid, which is like, you can see that there's a lot more men than there are women because there's a lot of labour in UAE, especially from India and other countries around there. And there's also very few people who are older than 65 or 70, and there's the fewest out of all of those three countries. And that has a big effect on the services that are required and the health system, and has a big effect on the economy and what it's like to live in those three countries. If you look at this is dynamics, which is called Hofstede Cultural Dynamics. And so this is a model by Hofstede, which looks at cultures according to different aspects. And here I'm going to compare UK, China and UAE, and I'm going to look through these 6 dimensions of the cultures. One of the big differences is individualism. UK is the most individualistic out of those 3 countries, And this is really interesting because it drives a lot of things in the culture. You can see this especially compared to when people ask me what's the biggest difference between China and UK, I will always say it's individualistic versus the group. And this is like the common thing that people say about Asian cultures, which is much more about the group. And so people in China associate themselves much more with being a member of the family, member of the company, member of the country, compared to in UK, where it's much more about what do I want, what is my requirements, what do I want in my life. I also find this interesting because people think that UK is much more individualistic, but actually it's not always been like this. If you look back 100 or 200 years, UK had a far less individualistic culture, and it was much more about duty. And you can see some of the history of how this is evolving as well and changing over time in UK, which I think is quite interesting. Another interesting thing is the long-term orientation in those three economies. I think you have to separate the way that the countries are run by the government and the individual culture, because they may be sometimes a bit different. For example, I think that the longest term from my experience is China, and the shortest term it would be the UK, in terms of how China is always having these long-term plans of 10 years and these long-term planning of where they want the economy to go, what kind of infrastructure they want to build in the future. I think partly just because of the political system in UK, there's elections every few years, so it seems like it's much more of a short term. We're going to make these policy changes, then there's going to be these policy changes, and it's kind of not got this long-term planning, which I think is one of the major differences in my experience of living in those two places. But in terms of UAE, I think it's important to separate the culture of the people and the government, because in terms of the government, very long-term planning in terms of similar to China, in that they're having all these long-term plans and long-term investment and all these kind of things. But in terms of the population, it's quite hard to say what the culture is, because UAE is such a mix. So the culture in Dubai is much more international culture. It's hard to say if it's long-term or short-term because it's such a mixture, and you'll get so many different experiences from the people in Dubai. And then another thing that they look at is the indulgence. The UK has the highest indulgence compared to China and UAE. And from my experience, I think this is definitely true, that in UK, people are much more likely to spend or enjoy themselves, or maybe to borrow money. I think this is most evident in the way that people think about money, and about people in UK are much more willing or looking to go into debt or borrow money. But in China, it's much more of a saving culture. People do save a much bigger proportion of their income. And I think this is like cultural reason going back from history, where they're looking to save money as insurance in the future, to have a safety net and have insurance in the future. Financial markets in UK has existed for a longer time, and so is a bit more developed, so there are more ways that people can borrow and save, but China is catching up from that. In terms of the cost of living in those three places, I would say that UK and Dubai are pretty similar. Dubai is probably going to be more expensive than UK. If you're comparing Dubai and London, it's probably a bit similar. Maybe if you're comparing Dubai and cities outside of London, then it's going to be more in Dubai and less in the cities outside of London and UK. I would say that China has the lowest cost of living out of those three. You can easily get quite a decent apartment, or you can spend a lot less on an apartment and daily living expenses such as buying groceries and all of these things in China than you can in Dubai and UK, where the cost of living and the cost of energy is also a lot higher. In China, you can spend very little on energy, on heating, on electricity. The cost of an apartment per month is, I think we're spending less than about £150 or £200 per year in heating, and in electricity it may be less than about £300 or £400 living in China per year, which is more like in China and Dubai it could be about £100 or £150 per month. So there's quite a big difference in the energy and the electricity and the water bills in China versus in Dubai and UK. So I actually decided to move to Dubai because I think that it's a better place to live. You can have a better standard of living in these three countries, partly because of being a smaller city and a smaller place. I think it can be more nimble and can create attractive policies that makes it easier to live there. One of the things that I realized in China and in UK and UAE is the experience of the media. I think partly because I don't consume media in UAE and China, but I do find that it's actually better not to consume any media or as little as possible. There's a great book by Tim Urban which is talking about why, which is the guy behind Wait But Why, and he's talking about why everything seems to be getting better in some ways. Like we're creating these amazing products such as the iPhone and things like that. But I love all of these countries, I think they're amazing places, and I really recommend, if you haven't lived abroad in these places, to check it out. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, like and subscribe and leave me a comment. Cheers.